We are going to give the floor to Mrs. Jennie King. Mrs. King, you are the head of climate research and policy at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London. Your experience on climate denialism and discourses of delay in implementing climate policy shall come of use in our discussion. So, again, the floor is yours, Ms. Jennie King, for 10 minutes. We can hear you, but we can see you, but we can't hear you. There is some issue with the audio.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Yes. I wonder whether the sound is of enough quality to be interpreted.
Let me know if I need to try a different microphone. Is that coming through at all?
Yeah, no, the interpreters confirm that the quality of the sound of the audio is too poor to be interpreted.
Okay, 1 second. Is that any better?
I think it's slightly better, but it is for interpreters to decide whether they're ready to interpret. Well, let's try. We'll see. But it's slightly better, and I would kindly ask our interpreters to do their best as they usually do. Let's see.
Okay. Please let me know if I need to stop at any point. Thank you very much for having me today, and I'm very sorry that I couldn't be there in person in Brussels. I think that both Johns have already covered a lot of the key narrative shifts in climate myth and disinformation in recent years.
No, Ms. King, the interpreters confirm that they cannot interpret that. So I suggest you continue in English, and we'll try to follow you. So please go ahead.
Okay, I'm very sorry about that. Thank you for having me today. There's only one point that I'd like to add from both of the speeches that have come previously around the narrative shifts in climate myth and disinformation. And I think it should be of great concern to this committee and to the European Union as a whole that public understanding of both climate change as a phenomenon and climate action are being distorted through the lens of disinformation, of conspiracy theories, and in the most extreme cases of targeted abuse. And what is happening to the environmental agenda now mirrors the fate of other policy issues in recent years, in particular public health, migration, civil rights and electoral integrity. And all of those areas require scrutiny and dialogue between citizens and governments. But unfortunately, the current information landscape has and continues to make it ever harder to build a public mandate that is based on credible science and is in line with the EU's commitments over the coming years. And I think another point on that front is that COVID-19, it was a crucible for mis and disinformation on all fronts, in which diverse groups came into collision online and new hybrid conspiracies were formed that mixed everything from vaccine skepticism and climate denial with extreme ideas that were linked to white supremacy or even anti-Semitism. And since 2020, ISD, the organisation that I work for, has documented how the trauma of that period is being weaponised by those opposed to climate action, who have successfully laundered what we call these delayist talking points and a new breed of climate denial firmly into the mainstream of public life. And that trend thrives in part due to a historic erosion of trust in institutions across Europe and beyond. And that's an erosion of trust in elected officials, in multilateral bodies like the European Parliament, in scientists, in the media. And what that trend means is that you have the drowning out of legitimate questions or even concerns about climate policy by this mass of baseless claims, of smear campaigns and of misleading propaganda, much of which is coming from the fossil fuel industry itself. And what our research reveals, as well as that of our wider coalition, which is called Climate Action Against Disinformation, is that this problem is also fueled and compounded by weaknesses in digital platforms. There are very clear vulnerabilities in the way that social media platforms are designed and governed at the moment, and it allows mis and disinformation content to rise to the surface, and in many cases to dominate public discussion about climate policy at a time when, as the IPC said in its report last year, there is a brief and rapidly closing window to act on this policy. And those flaws in our online space are continually exploited, not just by fossil fuel companies and those with vested interests in maintaining the carbon economy, but also by hostile actors who see climate as another axis to spread distrust, to drive division, and to weaken democratic processes in societies all across the European Union and around the world. There are three particular areas that I'd like to highlight today, which are advertising, monetization, and amplification on the online space. With advertising, the ecosystem online amplifies climate mis and disinformation in two really important ways. The first is that it creates a funding model for disinformation actors and outlets who are able to generate advertising revenue by spreading the most incendiary, false, or misleading content online. The second, which is maybe less considered in some of these policy discussions, is by increasing reach, as the advertising tools themselves can be applied to disinformation or greenwashing content to target consumers and citizens and other key constituencies. It's the case that digital advertising has a supply chain which remains very complicated and opaque, even to those who spend their entire lives trying to dig into them. And it's facilitated by technology which few of us in everyday life understand. And that vastly increases the opportunity for monetizing climate denial and the kinds of discourses of delay that John Cook and John Rosenbeek have spoken about in the previous speeches. And that's created a profit model which undermines the efforts of brands who have climate targets, but are inadvertently funding the worst forms of mis and disinformation by advertising without their knowledge on these sites. It also allows those with the greatest financial resources, such as Exxon, BP, some of those other entities that have been mentioned, to pay for exposure to millions of unsuspecting users, even when they are promoting, at best, misleading, and at worst, actively false claims about the climate crisis. For companies like Meta or Amazon or Twitter to generate revenue from content that denies climate change is a reality, that promotes non-viable solutions or that targets harassment against specific individuals. It should be unacceptable in any case, but it's even more acute when those same companies are continually touting their climate credentials and the E in their ESG agendas, their environmental agendas. I just wanted to illustrate with a couple of examples. One piece of research that we conducted with the University of Exeter last year showed that there were over 3,700 adverts live from fossil fuel-linked entities around the COP27 summit, and they spent roughly $3 to $4 million on just Facebook and Instagram campaigns in 3 months. The top 10 pages for ad volume or spend in that period were almost all industry PR and lobbying groups. And what's really important to notice here, that many of those groups are masquerading behind names that make them seem as if they're grassroots or community-led. Names like Energy Citizens or, Community Alliance for a Safe Future. And some of the most prolific advertisers posted ads with active climate denial. For example, claiming that there is not consensus around climate change amongst the scientific community, or asking questions like, has environmentalism become a religion? And as I said at the start, those campaigns are increasingly couched in quite divisive rhetoric that draws links between climate action and a supposed loss of civil liberties, shadowy agendas, or economic crisis. Google, as one case study, implemented a policy in 2021 which was explicitly intended to demonetize climate denial across its products and services. And Claire from GDI actually mentioned that in the previous session. But analysis that's been done by partners of ours, including the Dewey Square Group and Friends of the Earth, reviewed 113 of the top websites that are spreading climate misinformation, sites that cumulatively reach over 56 million weekly visits, according to the data we have at our disposal. And 80% of those sites displayed advertising via one or more of the major ad tech providers, such as Google and Amazon. And so those middleman companies are not only profiting from climate misinformation, but they're actually allowing sites who repeatedly share falsehoods and attacks to turn that activity into a viable business model. I think that takes me into the second point, which is that the crisis around mis and disinformation on climate change is not just an issue of false content alone, and that debate about content removal has obscured some of the bigger issues here, which is the role that distribution mechanisms play in amplifying and targeting content beyond its original audience. I think this was a really big theme in the session that took place directly before ours. And those mechanisms, whether it's the micro-targeting of adverts or recommendation algorithms, they constantly make decisions for users about what they see online in ways that are largely invisible to the average person. And they play an intrinsic role in the disinformation ecosystem, spreading dangerous content that might otherwise have had quite limited reach. So the largest technology companies, like Twitter, like Meta, like Google, they claim to be tackling disinformation, whether it's on climate or other issue sets, through policies within their terms of service. So, for example, they might say that they engage third-party fact-checkers, and the premise is that those entities will rate content as false or misleading, and that content will then be down-ranked or potentially removed, and maybe some punitive action will be taken against the accounts, depending on the severity of the content and the number of strikes already recorded by the platform. Those measures should be properly enforced based on the existing community guidelines in terms of service, and they should prevent repeat offenders from acting with impunity. Unfortunately, that is not the case, and even for the types of disinformation that are explicitly covered by company policies. Now, what we found at ISD, and it mirrors same trends in areas like public health, is that a very small group of actors create the majority of anti-climate content. They originate or amplify new lines of attack, and they have a disproportionate influence on the public debate across social media. Now, just to make things even worse, the highest traction posts, more often than not, come from verified or what are sometimes referred to as blue tick accounts, and pages who are afforded additional visibility and credibility via that status. In the 4-week period before, during, and directly after COP27, we found that just a dozen actors, so 12 accounts, posted nearly 400 times on Twitter using common disinformation language around climate, and they managed to garner an aggregate of nearly 350,000 shares from that content. Now, the organic reach of those accounts varies from 65,000 to 1.9 million followers. So those are just the people who choose to follow them, regardless of the wider amplification. And 9 of those 12 super spreader accounts were at the time and remain verified accounts. And what we know is that sensational content fuels the outrage economy, and it therefore serves the current business model of most platforms, and climate is not an exception in that case. Whether it's outright denial or other forms of disinformation, content like this is generally high engagement. It garners clicks and likes and shares and comments, and that increases the value proposition for advertisers on social media. And so when sites like Facebook, they tout their climate science centre, my response is that those efforts end up being somewhat moot. Facebook has said that they've had a reported 100,000 daily visitors to the Climate Science Centre in the past, but we know that organic content from known super spreaders of disinformation gains vastly more reach and visibility. And in 2021, a study from our COP26 intelligence unit found that just a handful of pages who were known to spread climate misinformation on Facebook actually outperformed the accounts within the platform's own Climate Science Centre by, on average, a factor of 12. So 12 times more likes and shares and comments. Meanwhile, in the same year on Twitter, just 16 misinformation super spreader accounts amassed over 500,000 likes and retweets for their climate content. And those 16 outperformed a combined total of 148 other prominent deniers and skeptics on the platform. So even within the climate opposition space, the influence is actually consolidated in a very small group. And one other thing that I want to emphasize is that the repeat offenders we're talking about here, they've often spread mis or disinformation on multiple topics. So that could be anti-vaccination sentiment, it could be genocide denial, it could be extreme conspiracies like QAnon or the Great Reset, or really damaging conspiracies around electoral fraud. And many of those accounts have been fact-checked multiple times by certified bodies like the International Fact-Checking Network, and yet they continually hit views and likes and share figures that are in the millions. And that should provide an even greater incentive for us to act, since an effective response against these accounts could have a false multiplier effect. I think I'm coming to the end of my time, so I just want to finish with what some of the solutions are. And then I'll take some questions on those. You know, the first, which I think has been talked about, is having robust and meaningful transparency on this issue within the DSA. The second is applying more stringent criteria for how advertising products and services are used, both online and offline. And the third, which is important for the European Union, is adopting a clear definition and parameters for this problem, which can galvanise a response across the region and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. King. Stay with us for the Q&A session that I open now. Let's go back to Mrs. Jennie King. I wonder whether you have been able to improve the quality of your audio, so you can be interpreted.
Fingers crossed. There were a huge number of questions, and some of them I think would require more in-depth consultation, and I'd be really happy to speak to any of the committee members about what's been discussed today. I'm going to break down my responses into three buckets. One is around sort of how this information spreads and why. The second is on the harm and impact of that information, and then just finishing off with some clarification around the policy asks. On that virality question that came from Representative Delbos-Corfield, Representative Daly and others, disinformation thrives in moments of crisis, and in particular moments where the fabric of social life is breaking down for one reason or another. That can be economic crisis, social crisis, political crisis. And disinformation actors are nothing if not opportunistic. That is how this ecosystem survives and how it continues to achieve impact. And the Ukraine war is just one in a very unfortunate series of turbocharging events that has fueled both the issue for climate change, but also for other policy areas. COVID was one, the cost of living crisis is another, and now we have the ongoing repercussions and fallout from the conflict. So what you have are a confluence of factors that are creating the most fertile soil we have probably seen in recent history for this kind of information to penetrate the mainstream and to mobilize the kind of general public audience who may otherwise have never engaged or even come into contact with this sort of narrative framing beforehand. The other, which I think was a really important point by Representative Daly, is around the role that mainstream media play with this. And I would like to reiterate that point, that in the large flagship report we produced in 2021 called Deny, Deceive, Delay, that we had an entire section about the role that mainstream outlets across broadcast, print and digital were playing in both amplifying and platforming the worst examples of mis and disinformation. And we actually analysed the URLs or the domains linking to media outlets that were most commonly cited across social media. And one point I'd like to emphasise there is that a lot of outlets are towing a very conscious line in making sure that their reporting in their sort of breaking news sections comes across as more sober or more neutral, and then providing space in their op-ed and feature pages for some of the worst examples of outright denialism, attacks on climate scientists, attacks on institutions, rejection of science, etc. And that's how they balance it out, is by saying, oh, well, we carve out a space in our opinion pages for this diversity of viewpoint. And I could give a range of examples. I would also say that the UK and the US media are currently serving as content hubs transnationally, not just in the English-speaking world, Asia Pacific, but also in context across the European Union for originating climate denial arguments, which then get excerpted, translated, and reposted in the domestic media environment. So that is a very important part of this equation. Going to Representative Grappini's point, what we've seen happen with climate is it become an axis for polarization. So an issue set that can drive division, regardless of the substance of the policy that's being discussed. And I think one really good example of that is the climate lockdown conspiracy, which ISD wrote a kind of forensic unpacking of a few years ago, and which is resurging now with the pushback around 15-minute cities and traffic calming measures. And that's an example where exactly what you were talking about, that the climate agenda is increasingly being framed writ large, regardless of what policy is actually being discussed. The entire notion of combating climate change is being framed as a pretext to implement authoritarianism and to strip people of their civil liberties. And that has very little bearing to the real public consultations that are happening around mitigation and adaptation. And it's much more a form of tribal polarization that is to do with identity and where people see incursions on their liberties, particularly in the aftermath of COVID-19. And what's happened in the process is that the fossil fuel industry and those kind of very well-funded think tanks, lobbyists, PR groups have come into collision with this much more organic and amorphous blob online of extremist and conspiracist movements and ideologies. And just to comment very briefly on the hostile state interference question from Representative Delbos-Corfield, is that I would say some of the case studies that we've documented, for example, in relation to Russia and China, so Kremlin-sponsored propaganda networks, Chinese state media, are exploiting those fractures. Yes, they might have geopolitical positions that they want to land in terms of maintaining reliance on oil and gas, but actually a lot of the propaganda or articles in RT Germany, for example, are instead trying to prey upon this supposed elitism within the climate agenda and drawing an us versus them frame between different pockets of society and between different political parties. And a really interesting trend from around COP27 was that they were couching this opposition to climate action in supposedly progressive rhetoric. So, for example, they were pitting the global north against the global south by saying the net zero agenda is counter to human rights and it's going to keep people in Africa in poverty. So they're actually using what comes across as kind of liberal language in order to make an argument for maintaining reliance on oil and ultimately not pursuing any form of the Paris Agreement or the COP platform. In terms of harm and impact, really briefly, to Representative Daly's point on the far left thing, I think the only reason that we put that in the glossary is just to show an awareness that disinformation can come from across the political spectrum. The vast proportion of what we've documented in terms of high traction and harmful content has come from the far right or extreme far right end of the spectrum, but it doesn't mean that it cannot come for those who might affiliate or self-identify elsewhere. And in terms of impact, I think there is a huge danger in assuming that climate is a settled topic and sort of resting on our laurels from a communications perspective. And I do think that without a strong public mandate, you are going to see a weakening of ambition, both within domestic governments and transnationally. And also you're going to see potential escalation to violence, like what's happened in Oxford with this 15-minute cities controversy, councillors there received death threats. We had, British fascist groups protesting with placards on the streets of that city and being bussed in from all over the country. There is the potential for real-world harm here. There is the potential for escalation to violence, and there is the potential that we stifle the level of urgency that is needed to really achieve progress on this topic. Ditto at COP27, we're never going to be able to say one tweet influence the negotiated outcome. Causality of that nature is too difficult to substantiate, but we can say that there were 650 lobbyists present at the summit, as documented by Global Witness, and it's difficult not to see the impact that had in the text in terms of the weakening of language around the phase out of, fossil fuel reliance, etc. And then very finally and really quickly on the policy asks, Representative Delbos-Corfield, what we were saying is that there's the need for a strong definition and that needs to come from a multilateral institution. So a definition of what climate mis and disinformation constitutes, and therefore what we are actually trying to tackle through scientific and media literacy, public education, community consultation and engagement, etc. And that without that, it is very difficult to galvanise a coordinated response. And then on advertising, that there are two things happening in parallel. One, as you mentioned, is that some brands are advertising on the worst disinformation sites without even realising, and so they're giving money to, RT or to Breitbart or wherever it might be, without realising because they're going through these intermediary ad tech providers like Google and Amazon. But then equally, actual disinformers are also using advertising products and services on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. So it's two different and quite separate parts of the equation, both of which fuel disinformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. King, and thank to all our speakers for their remarkable contribution to this session on such an important issue as climate change. So we kindly ask them to disconnect so we can finalize our session in the committee. If there are no requests, we will move to the last point of our agenda. Yeah. And it's about the next meetings. The dates of the next meetings are Tuesday, 21st March, from 9 to 10:30, which will be holding the ordinary meeting, and from 10:30 to 13, we will be holding a parliamentary meeting. So at the end of this session, I would like to thank our speakers again, members,